Hi, welcome back. So before we move forward with some more content and specifically some terms that I think will be helpful for y'all, particularly with the second literature discussion board when you're talking about Mary Louise Pratt's concept of contact zones, I just wanted to make a quick little plug/reminder. There is a very brief but very important kind of supplementary reading that's listed on your course plan with the other readings from a chapter in our textbook called New Spain. And you don't actually have to read all of it because there's some passages kind of in between the pages of the chapter. I mean, you can certainly read them if you want to, but they're not necessary. They kind of interrupt the important stuff. But altogether, it's like 3 pages, and it has got some really crucial historical context that you should read before you start in on Cabeza de Vaca's narrative and the letters about the Pueblo Revolt. Way more context than I really want to go through in a PowerPoint. I want to keep this one a little bit more brief than the last one. And it's all there for you anyway. And it's not a terribly difficult read. So please do yourself a favor and read that. It's important. I also wanted to show y'all a map that depicts basically the territories or areas that were under Spanish control around 1600. So of course it took some time from the late 1400s to this point to conquer all of this territory, and it goes much further south than what we can see here. But in terms of what we would consider North America, this just gives you, I think, a sense of the vastness of the territory. So obviously all of Mexico is accounted for here. What we know now is the state of Florida, a good share of California, and then way up into North America, much further than people normally realize. So I just thought we'd take a second to look at that, just to give you a sense of, again, the vastness of the territory that the Spanish were trying to control when the Pueblo Revolt took place, and why they might have had difficulty maintaining that control. It's a lot of land and a lot of people, and that vastly outnumbered the colonizers. So that's where a lot of the anxiety is going to come from when the revolts do start, understandably. Okay, so one of the readings you have for this unit is from a book by a professor named Mary Louise Pratt, who it's called Imperial Eyes. It's about travel writing, but she came up with a really important concept that shows up in a lot of different academic disciplines: literature, psychology, sociology, anthropology, all kinds of places. And it's been around for quite a while, and I think a really important concept for y'all to understand. So this is taken from that passage. It's not the whole thing. You'll have to read the whole thing on your own. But basically the definition of contact zones, which is, you're going to talk about the concept of contact zones in your second literature discussion board. So I think it's important that we kind of break down the definition going forward. Mary Louise Pratt defines contact zones as social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power. That's an important part of the definition, such as colonialism, slavery, or their aftermaths, as they are lived out in many parts of the world today. So she was using this concept, this term, to look at more modern contexts and how the legacy of colonialism and slavery can create these social spaces with groups of people. But hopefully, in reading this definition and reading the rest of the passage, all kinds of things will pop out, stand out for you when reading the relation of Cabeza de Vaca and the Pueblo Revolt, because those are both pretty exemplary examples of contact zones in action. So that's what you're going to talk about. Some other terms that I feel would help kind of better understand what's going on in those historical contexts, and that'll help you better understand the concept of contact zones. Othering. Okay, so what is othering? First of all, this is something that groups of people do, cultures do, and it is imperative to creating a sense of national identity. Okay, now we're not necessarily talking about patriotism, which is typically considered a good thing. Nationalism is a very different idea and usually has more negative connotations and involves a considerable amount of othering. But in order to create a sense of who you are, you have to decide and define who you are not. And that means identifying groups of people and maybe pushing them to the fringes or excluding them from things, denying them access to maintain that sense of national identity. So that leads us to practices of admittance and segregation. So again, it's this idea of, who's allowed in and who's not. And then even once you are in, maybe certain groups are permitted from entering certain social spaces, participating in certain activities, kept in certain areas, to them, forced to keep to themselves and not venture out of those areas. Segregation. And it might be legal or it might be social or it might be both. Othering helps form and sustain boundaries, a sense of boundaries between who you are and who you're not, us versus them, and who you feel yourself to be in terms of a nation, who a group feels themselves to be in terms of a nation. Because we have to remember, with some exceptions, largely nations are arbitrarily drawn up and defined. Unless you have put up an actual physical wall, which more times than not is a symbolic representation of boundaries than anything else. But it's a process of othering when we do that. And those lines that are drawn, they don't really exist. You can't, you can walk from Canada into the United States. It wouldn't be easy, but you could do it. People walk from the South to the United States all the time. And that makes some people very uncomfortable. We're not going to get into that, but that's because they feel like certain boundaries have been transgressed in that process. And in doing so, I guess the integrity, the sanctity, the sacredness of one's national character is at risk when people do that. But again, it's all human constructs. So this helps groups distinguish between what is home and what is not home, what is certain and what is uncertain. So within the space that has been drawn up and defined lies certainty, outside of that lies uncertainty. Within it lies home, outside of it lies away. And unfortunately, the process of othering frequently involves the demonization and dehumanization of certain groups of people, meaning that the whole kind of us versus them, the us is always going to be considered the superior group to the them, and part of that means talking about and thinking about them, the other, as being somehow less human than we are, not quite as human as us. Lesser than, maybe even evil, hence the demonization. And so this would be a mini assignment that I would ask you to do in a face-to-face class in a group, which would be to find an example of this othering taking place in the reading Letter on the Pueblo Revolt, because there's a considerable amount of this that happens in groups being pushed and pushed and pushed to the boundary, having their practices demonized, having them, being considered, treated as less than human, and then, what that ends up leading to. The conflicts that occur. So, might want to just take a note of that particular prompt for later, possibly. Hegemony. Okay, so hegemony, sometimes pronounced hegemony, depending on who's talking. Hegemony or hegemony is kind of a mind-bending concept. It forces you to hold two opposite ideas together in your head at the same time. Forced consent. That is, at its most basic, that is what hegemony means. So you're probably thinking, how can something be consensual? How can somebody be consenting if they're forced to do so? Those two things mean the opposite of each other. It's an oxymoron. Well, human beings don't like holding conflicting ideas in their heads, so I can understand if this is uncomfortable. But this isn't always a bad thing. It frequently is, but it isn't always. So there's a lot of ways to get people to do what you want to. All right. You can threaten them with violence. You can threaten to take away resources, withhold resources from them. There's all kinds of things. You can incentivize them in more positive ways. There's all kinds of ways that you can get people to do what you want. But one particularly powerful way, and it's something that we all experience in our lives a lot of the time without even realizing it. That's kind of the insidious part about it, is a lot of it's sort of subconscious, is hegemony. So, sorry, when I went to college, that's what we called it, but hegemony's fine too. So I'm going to give a kind of sort of silly everyday example that comes to my mind when I think of something that I'm not being forced to do, but that I still feel like I have to do, because if I don't, there will be more like social consequences. So the example I'm going to give is shaving. All right. So as a woman, it is considered hygienic and proper for me to, say, shave my armpits, or shave my legs. Okay. Some women even have to shave more than that. They won't tell you they do, but they do. Because guess what? We are adults and we are mammals, and adult mammals grow hair, women and men. However, somewhere along the line in our history, actually it was in the 1920s when women started wearing shorter skirts, somewhere along the line in history, people decided that body hair is unsightly and unfeminine on women. And because of that, women spend a lot of time, frankly, a lot of resources, money, trying to make it appear as though we do not have body hair when we do. So if you think about all the time that, ladies who are listening, all the time that you've spent shaving, and what would happen if you stopped? All right, you're not going to get put in prison. You know, nobody's going to fine you or punish you in any kind of outward way. But people would notice, wouldn't they? And they would probably treat you differently, and probably not in a way that you would like. I know that if I stopped shaving and I went into a classroom full of students and I had hairy armpits, they would notice, and they would have a hard time, you know, focusing on other things, because it would be so shocking to them. And that would be, you know, embarrassing. So I think it's, again, kind of a silly example. And I'm sure there's all kinds of things that guys have to do too. And we know for a fact there are, that, you know, they're not being forced to do per se, but if they don't do them, there will be other social consequences tied to shame. And yeah, again, kind of, it's more of a social thing. So there's a video that I've put in the folder of corresponding videos that explains hegemony much better. Because there's some there's some good ones too. One of the examples they use is Christmas trees. You know, why we do that, why we feel like we have to have a Christmas tree at Christmas. It's, you know, what's the big deal if you don't? Oh, it's not Christmas if you don't. So that's just one of the examples they give. It's about a 10-minute video. It does a much better job explaining the concept than I do, but one of the things that I would have y'all look for in class, again as a mini assignment, is an example of cultural hegemony at work in the coming of the Spanish and the Pueblo Revolt. So it's not all violence used to control people in those situations. So might want to take note of that for later. Give you something to talk about on the discussion board, or maybe on the test. Okay. Another concept that's important to understand, transculturation. Transculturation is, I mean, you know, trans typically means crossing. So transculturation is the process whereby members of subordinated or marginal groups select and invent from materials transmitted by a dominant culture. So that's, again, a concept from the Pratt reading. A really good example of this is the Virgin de Guadalupe, which I'm sure you're familiar with the image. I put a video for that as well that explains the history behind that and how it's an example of transculturation in the corresponding videos folder. And again, I would have asked y'all to look for 3 examples from our First Encounters readings of transculturation. So you may want to, you know, take note of that. And this video is almost out of time, and that's okay because that's the end. All right. See you in the next unit. Take care.